Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Firoza Godrej, and I am a board member of the Asia Society India Center. And I'm really delighted to see members, patrons, and friends from across the world join us this evening. Thank you so much. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Asia Society is a leading educational organization dedicated to building awareness about policy, business, education, and arts from across Asia on a global stage. Through our 13 global centers across Asia, Europe, and the US, we stay committed to sharing contemporary studies, highlighting emerging trends, and spotlighting innovative solutions with a view to deepen understanding and engagement between Asia and the rest of the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has slightly altered, I should say significantly altered, our day-to-day functioning. Stretched national and local lockdowns, closure of educational institutions, and working from home has become the new normal. Unfortunately, this indoor confinement has resulted in the emergence of a shadow pandemic, and we're going to be hearing more about this from our speakers. Through a three-part series, we hope to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the mental well-being of three specific vulnerable groups: our children, who we addressed at the last session, the women in our community, which we're addressing in this session, and our elders, which we will address in our third session. Several global studies have observed that women are disproportionately affected physically and emotionally during a large-scale health crisis. Therefore, when a pandemic with a scale of COVID-19 hits countries, it's an absolute disaster. And the women are not the only immediate losers in terms of employment and livelihood, but are also significantly exposed to more serious mental health risks emerging from issues such as, I hate to use the word, but abuse and insufficient institutional support. Over the last year, we have seen and heard and read about a multitude of these certain crisis situations unfolding in our communities and in our cities, both large cities and smaller cities. As we gradually recover from the pandemic, how do we identify and support these women in distress? What institutional support is most effective in times like these? How can community-led initiatives reach and support women from marginalized groups experiencing anxiety and, worse still, depression? Our conversation this evening will discuss this and many more aspects of women's mental health in detail. In our efforts to include various voices transcending across class, caste, and gender, we will be joined by a really impressive panel that has been put together this evening of people working in community, health workers, associated, and I must congratulate and thank the Banyan Academy, who will share their experiences of working with women undergoing mental illnesses. We have the honor of hosting a distinguished group of people to discuss, specialists in their field, to discuss today's subject. Please allow me a few moments of your time to introduce our esteemed speakers. We have Dr. Prabha Chandra. He's a professor of psychiatry. She's a professor of psychiatry. She's in charge of perinatal psychiatry services, as well as the Nimhans Center for Wellbeing at the Nimhans Institute, Bangalore, India. Thank you, Dr. Prabha Chandra, for joining us. We have Dr. Sumitra Pathare. He's a consultant psychiatrist and the director of the Center for Mental Health and Law and Policy. Thank you, Dr. Pathare, for joining us this evening. Unfortunately, we do not have Professor Ashwini with us. She's had not a family crisis, but there is an issue and she couldn't be with us. But we're equally delighted, really, and I'm very, very happy that Kalavati, a service user of the Banyan Academy, is going to join us, because here you're really going to have a hands-on experience. What many in the audience will say, we're going to be discussing a case study. And I'm so happy that Shapan Bhaskar is going to help us and facilitate us in this, because Kalavati does not speak English and requires a translator. But don't worry, audience members, it's going to be a real eye-opener, this conversation with Kalavati. And last but not the least, Mrinalini Ravi is co-lead at the Sundaram Fastener Center for Social Action and Research at the Banyan Academy of Leadership in Mental Health, and she will be directing the conversation this evening. Thank you, Mrinalini. We are really honored to invite you here in our midst today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we proceed. All those who are joining us on Zoom, please leave your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. For our audience on Facebook, please drop them in the comments section. I would now like to invite Mrinalini to commence the discussion. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening for a very important session. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody, and good morning to those joining us from other time zones. It's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be moderating this session with such illustrious panelists. I'm very happy to, be putting this discussion together. Right from the beginning, we said that, we wanted to make it into a very accessible and storytelling format so that, many of these, the stories and the lives of people are shown in with the kind of visceral spirit that, students and stakeholders need to take away. So I would just like to start with a few opening remarks, just take a minute of your time. Or the virus, we know that it affects everybody equally, but the pandemic had very differing effects amongst, the demographics. So we had women and people from ultra vulnerable communities experiencing a lot more distress and losses during this time, compared to their counterparts. So we know that domestic violence amongst women increased. The National Commission for Women reported that there was a 100% increase in the number of cases, domestic violence cases during the pandemic. We also had women who were health workers who were cast aside by their families, and Dr. Prabha will be speaking on some of these stories. And many of them who lost family members, they were not able to get back. They were abandoned and they felt isolated. ASHA workers did not get paid during this time, and many of them staged protests, and they really gave it. They were really a very integral part of COVID response, whether it was in terms of community kitchens where women composed a large part of getting these community kitchens together, making masks and sanitizers, but they were not adequately compensated. There were so many SHGs that were formed, but they had to sort of put in their own money to be able to afford the services, and they had the spirit of sisterhood and community, as a result of which they were able to transcend the losses that they experienced, or transcend the deprivations that they had, to be there for one another. And there are so many testimonials from women about not being there for others during a lockdown, especially those who experience domestic abuse as a result of whether it was social distancing or whether it was inability to travel. And in addition, we know that women only contribute to 1/5 of India's GDP, but form like 75% of the informal workforce. But but they don't have any access to papers. They don't have access to rights as a result, and so they again missed out on the dry rations and so many other social entitlements that were organized during this time. And access to food has become a huge issue. Nutrition has always been an issue, but now it has further been impeded as a result of the pandemic. And with 80% of women being 80% of the nurse and midwife workforce being women, only 13% of women actually were a part of the national task force, COVID task force. So there are so many systemic, familial, societal, and environmental losses that were exacerbated. These have always been there, but they've been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic. So we've been talking statistics, we've been talking, plans and interventions, but we need to get some of these stories out in the forefront, as and that's what we're aiming to do through this webinar. And I would like to start this webinar by welcoming my colleague Shapin and my friend Kalavati from Thrissur. Kalavati has been accessing Home Again services for the past 5 years. She has had experience of institutionalization in the Thrissur Mental Hospital, and she is also, she's a tailor, and now she's been working with us. She's experienced several losses as a result of domestic abuse and other, familial related issues. She will be, sharing her story with us. And Shapin will be translating. If you have any questions with in this regard, you can please put it in the Q&A and we will address it at the end of this. Okay, we'll start with Dr. Prabha then, and I will ask Kalavati to come in after that. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Prabha. Yeah.
Hi, Mrinalini, and I thank the Asia Society India for inviting me once more to their very interesting panels that they put together. This is something which has been an area that I study very carefully, and which requires a lot of sensitivity. Even as I'm discussing people's stories, I'm aware that I have to thank them for agreeing for their stories to be spoken over here, and for the fact that they have shared their innermost thoughts with us so that we can get a bit more educated. So I want to say at the outset that I do not, I want to sort of respect the people who agreed to share their stories, and it's a real benefit to us that they have done so. So my big thanks to all the people whom I see or who I work with, who are willing to share their story so that their voices get heard and other people's voices get heard too. So having said that, I'd like to start with, somebody who came to us for help and who was a health worker herself. Her husband was diagnosed to have COVID, and the family was extremely suspicious about the fact that she was a health worker. The husband was also a community worker, but when the husband got COVID, she was blamed and was told that it was because of her that the COVID had come home. They prevented her from seeking help. Finally, with great difficulty, with support from friends and colleagues, when she actually sought help, unfortunately, her husband passed away in the same hospital. Both of them were admitted, and her husband passed away. Following which, I think widowhood was a big trauma. She was from a rural community. The family took her and the child, the paternal family, the husband's family, took her and the child away to the rural community. So she didn't have the supports that she had in her city, her colleagues, her friends, her workplace. And it was extremely hard. The family, the husband had lots of loans because he'd recently started a business, and all of that was put on her. She came to me, and that was a time when after the funeral, they did not allow her to be anywhere near the funeral. They did not allow her parents' family to meet her because they continuously blamed her for the loss of their son. And when she came back to meet me, honestly, the sorrow in her face and the loneliness and the solitude, it was COVID. I knew I was sort of completely violating protocol, but I hugged her. And I think it was just, for me and for her, it was one of the most poignant moments, because she said, after 20 days, I've had somebody who's being genuine with me, who's asking me how I feel, and who's basically supporting me and is being authentic with me. So I think this whole journey in the first wave of intense stigma around the pandemic, of not of blaming health workers, particularly women health workers. This is just one situation, one person I knew, but I think there were several like this who struggled, and then the sort of whole stigma of widowhood in our community, where the rituals meant that, her Mangalsutra was removed, things happened. And here she was, somebody who was herself quite a liberated woman, working, studied, but yet she was completely helpless under the circumstances. So this is one situation I felt that, sort of COVID intersected with a whole range of other issues, the whole sense of gender disadvantage. Her young child was taken away from her because they said, she was not capable. Being a health worker, she could not support her husband. Her husband died in spite of her being in the system. And so she was not good enough to look after her 4-year-old, and who was taken away from her. And she's still fighting to get him back. So I think it was sort of these multiple challenges that, this young woman faced. And I think we as a system, I don't think we gave her enough. I think that the system did not prepare itself for all the various issues, the social issues that came with the COVID pandemic, particularly for women like these. So this is just one situation I want to highlight.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Prabha. So I'll just, before we get to the next case study, I'd like to bring in Soumitra here. So now we also know that women also are responsible for like almost 9.8 times more chores at the house than men. Largely, this is a generalization. So they not only did not have systemic support, but they didn't have support at home either. And they had to come back and they take care of their children. And this is, of course, an extreme case, and we'll get to it. But before we talk about the larger system, the household supports that are not available for women. Has anything been done in this regard from government point of view? Because we also know that women don't have access to social entitlement. So we know that there were 70 million women in India who don't have access to ration cards. So as a result of which they don't get access to the dry ration support and all the other social entitlements that have been offered. So Soumitra, would you like to come in here to just to start with basic household, and then to talk about systemic supports that are needed and that are being provided but are not reaching people?
Thanks, Mrinalini. Thanks for that question. I'm going to try and contextualize some of these issues in the broader context that we operate in India even before the pandemic. Okay, because I think it's important to realize where we started off from and where we are now. So let's take mental health problems. There is a National Mental Health Survey from 2016, which basically shows that about 70 to 85% of people with a diagnosable mental illness. I'm not talking of people with having non-diagnosable mental health problems, but people with diagnosable mental illness, of which they found about 150 million people in this country. About 70 to 85% of them do not receive any treatment at all. Okay, so this is the situation before the pandemic. What has happened after the pandemic is that demand has gone up, so that there's many more people now affected by mental health problems, and the supply has remained as it is, which means the availability of mental health professionals and services. Now, what you're going to get in a situation like this is you're going to get a crowding out of people, so that's where intersectionalities then start to come in. So, if you're a man and you're an urban man and you're an urban man who can afford services, you're probably likely to get those mental health services. If you're a woman, you're less likely to get it. If you're a woman from a Dalit background, and if you're a woman from a rural area from a Dalit background, you might as well say goodbye. You're not going to get anything at all. So, we have to take these intersectionalities into account. If you're going to try and understand mental health problems, they need to be contextualized. And when we talk about women, I think it's important to understand that it's not, all women are not just one homogeneous category, for example. Then that's where the intersectionalities come into play. So that very often, for example, an upper caste woman in an urban setting from a very affluent family is actually better off in terms of mental health support than a poor Dalit man in a rural setting. I'm intentionally giving you extreme examples to show that there are these intersectionalities which come into play. So we shouldn't be homogenizing, these issues in this sort of way. The thing that worries me is specifically about women. Okay, in India before the pandemic, we suicide, for example, is the number one cause of death for young women aged 18 to 39. In fact, many of you will be surprised to know that suicide is now ahead of the maternal mortality rate for India, for young women in that age group. Now, that is the situation before the pandemic. India, 1 out of 3 women who die of suicide in the world happens to be an Indian woman. This is, again, I'm telling you stuff before the pandemic. We don't know what happened during the pandemic. We don't know what has happened after the pandemic. What we do know is that if there is an increase in domestic violence, which there is reports of increase in domestic violence during the pandemic lockdowns, then we do know that 1 out of 3 women who die of suicide in this country have a history of domestic violence. So if you're going to get an increase in domestic violence, you're probably going to get an increase in the number of suicides. So that's just one example. Now, we don't have any data. We don't have any data because the National Crime Records Bureau, for whatever it is, the data that they put out, it has its problems, but that data is not even put out in the public domain. Give you one example of what happens in rural areas, for example. If a woman dies by suicide, she would not be classed as a farmer suicide, for example, as long as if the land patta was not on her name, then that's not called a farmer suicide. Even if she comes from a rural farming household, if she's a farm laborer, that wouldn't get counted as a suicide. Now, what happens is if you have a situation where most of the pattas are going to be on men's names, no women farmers are dying of suicide in this country. So that's another intersectionality which we've not addressed, where gender and farming and agriculture and suicide. So I think if you're going to have a more enlightened discussion in our society, then we do need to actually look and talk about these intersectionalities and how they impact different people in different circumstances.
Absolutely, thank you. And I was also reading a UN report about subsistence farming and how many women, did not have, because again as a result of not having identity cards and not being able to avail some of the benefits, they've had to move professions. And I'm also seeing that women are the victims of information asymmetry, and also it's very easy to blame women for everything, right? So there was at some point they said the misinformation that was happening as a result of COVID, like women can cause COVID more than men, and pregnant women have a higher propensity to spread the virus. So somehow it is just becoming as a system. It always has been, but even through COVID, we didn't spare women in our marginalization, because we said that we isolated so many millions of women as a result of information asymmetry and wrong and misinformation, and they were there was like disastrous impacts as a result. And we also saw that pregnant women couldn't take ambulances, so they had to go by their own cars, and maternal mortality also increased during this time, and many women were turned away because there was no healthcare that was available. Yeah, Soumitra, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that what you said about women. We have a community health program called Atmiyata, and where we have local volunteers who provide very basic counseling services. Now, what happened during the COVID lockdown was we had to, which used to be face to face, shift it to do it on the phone. Now, there are huge challenges when you do it on the phone, especially when you're talking to women. Because in many households, there'll be one phone which the man has, okay? Which means the woman has to request the man, usually the husband, to allow her to speak to the counselor. Now, almost guaranteed, the husband will say, put it on speakerphone, okay? How does she tell this counselor about the domestic abuse that is coming from the man when the phone is on the speakerphone? So while we talk about online and digital and all, there are practical challenges in the socio-cultural situation that we currently find ourselves in. And these are not very easy things to happen to deal with, or for that matter, young girls. If there is one smartphone in the house and there is a 8-year-old boy and a 15-year-old girl, I can tell you the 8-year-old boy will get it for his school. The 15-year-old girl will be told it's okay if you miss a few classes. So, these are things which already existed, but the COVID crisis has actually exacerbated these problems.
hugely. And again, some studies have reported that 65% of parents are saying that they want to stop the girl child from going to school, because there's only one smartphone, and the resources are limited. People have lost jobs, so the first collateral damage will be the girl child. And again, as a result of 79% of Indian women not being able to access the smartphone, they can't call for support to the counselor, they can't even call during a crisis. So yes, that's a very important point. And Dr. Prabha, you had your hand up?
Yeah, before I speak, I just wanted to check if Kalavati would like to come in, or shall I go ahead?
Actually, yes. Okay, I'll just request Kalavati to come in, because we're going to talk about homelessness and the experience of homeless women. And before Kalavati speaks, we did a study with the World Health Organization on the impact of COVID on ultra vulnerable groups, and what we also the risk of abuse amongst women, homeless women, increased multifold, and we know that even without doing a research on it. But access to toilets again became a problem, because you need to spend money and you don't have that money to pay for the toilets, and so therefore women have to relieve themselves in early hours or late night, and that leads to its own safety concerns. And women with mental health issues who are homeless again lost reproductive rights, and that I know Dr. Prabha, you will be speaking about it, so I just wanted to introduce it in Kalavati's case as well. And the myriad losses and not being able to access MTPs through this period has led to so much psychosocial distress. And so what I'm requesting Sharpen and Kalavati to speak about is that all this happened to them even before the pandemic, right? So and things have just exacerbated after. So Sharpen, if Kalavati can just give her story, and then we can move to Dr. Prabha.
Right. Namaskaram.
Namaskar.
എൻ്റെ പേര് കലാവതി. പാലക്കാട് ജില്ലയിലെ എൻ്റെ വീട്. എൻ്റെ അച്ഛനമ്മയ്ക്ക് 7 പേരാ. 6ാമത്തെ സന്തതിയെ ഞാൻ. എനിക്ക് 6 വയസ്സായപ്പോൾ സ്കൂളിൽ ചേർത്തി. പഠിക്കാൻ പറ്റാത്ത സിറ്റുവേഷൻ ആയിരുന്നു. പിന്നെ എൻ്റെ ഒപ്പം പഠിച്ച പിള്ളേരൊക്കെ നല്ല നിലയിലെത്തി. എനിക്ക് അതുപോലെ ആവണം എന്നൊരു ചിന്തയുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. പിന്നെ ഞാൻ തുന്നല് പഠിച്ച് ട്രെയിലറായി. പിന്നെ എനിക്ക് ആ വിഷമമൊക്കെ മാറി. അത് 21 കുറച്ച് പഠിച്ചുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന സമയത്ത് ടെൻഷനായി. പിന്നെ പരമാവധി വീട്ടുകാർ നോക്കി. മാറാണ്ടായപ്പോ ബാബുവിനെ കല്യാണം കഴിച്ചു വെച്ചു.
Kalavati, ഒരു മിനിറ്റ്. ഷാപ്പിൻ സർ ഇപ്പോ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് ചെയ്യാറ്.
So Kalavati ഒന്ന് വെയിറ്റ് ചെയ്യും, ഞാൻ ഒന്ന് പറയട്ടെ. So actually Kalavati is a 38 years old female from Palakkad district, one of the districts from Kerala, and she's saying that she's belong to a socio-economic background family, and she got 7 siblings and parents at her home, and she's actually very poor in academic performance. So once she studied until 6th standard, and once after finished that, she joined in a tailoring work, and she was good at in tailoring. And at the age of 21, she got married. The family actually no way to provide much care for her, so the family decided to get some person for him, a man for her, and she got married with a man. So that's it. And Kalavati, ബാക്കി പറഞ്ഞു.
ബാബുവിനെ കല്യാണം കഴിച്ചു വെച്ചു. വീട്ടുകാരെല്ലാരും കൂടെ. സ്നേഹം ബാബു എന്നോട് പ്രകടിപ്പിക്കാറില്ല. അങ്ങനെ ഇങ്ങനെയായിട്ട് 3 മക്കൾക്ക് അമ്മയെ ഒന്നും അറിയില്ല, എങ്ങനെ കുട്ടികളുണ്ടായെന്ന് അറിയില്ല എനിക്ക്. അങ്ങനെ ഇങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ ആയിട്ട് 3 മക്കളുണ്ടായി. ആൺകുട്ടി ജനിച്ചപ്പിന്നെ എന്നെ തീരെ ഇഷ്ടമല്ലാതായി. എന്നെ ക്രൂരമായി പ്രവർത്തിക്കുകയായിരുന്നു. ഞാൻ അവിടെ ഇവിടെയൊക്കെ പോയി ഒളിഞ്ഞു നിൽക്കാറുണ്ട്. പിന്നെ പോലീസ് പടിഞ്ഞാറക്കോട്ടയിൽ അഡ്മിറ്റ് ആക്കി. പിന്നെ
wait. So once after got married with the person, actually she realized that she's an alcoholic person, and after the third birth of the
third child,
the husband used to abuse her, and he's also an alcoholic person. Every day she faced lots of abuse from him, and she just left home multiple times because of this abuses, and she's not actually not in the conditions to bear all these the abuses from her husband.
Yeah. Cholunga. Kalavati cholunga.
ഇത് പോലീസ് പടിഞ്ഞാറക്കോട്ടയിൽ അഡ്മിറ്റ് ആക്കി. ട്രീറ്റ്മെന്റ് കഴിഞ്ഞപ്പോ എന്നെ ആരും വീട്ടുകാർ ഭർത്താവ് ആരും ഏറ്റെടുക്കാറില്ല. പിന്നെ ബാനയിൽ ചേർന്ന് ഇപ്പൊ ഞാൻ ഹാപ്പിയായി. എല്ലാവർക്കും എന്റെ നന്ദി.
Thank you. She can turn off her video, Shapin. You can translate the rest.
Yeah. So actually, she's saying that she was actually used to get so much of abuse from her husband, and one day she left the home, and the local police got her, and once they realized she's struggling with, and she's in mental health concerns, they admitted in one of the mental health centers in Kerala. And so once after admitted at mental health center, the family support completely stopped, and there is no support she received after that. So where we are, the Banyan actually met her, and we screened her. Once we realized her capabilities, we take her out, we reintegrate her, discharged from her hospital, and now she's accessing our Home Again unit in Thrissur and working as a tailor. And even she's capable to do independent life and managing everything. She now like to go back to family, but the family is still not ready to take her back because of the past experience and the mental health issues. And still the person, the husband, who is an actually alcoholic, still living in that family without any restriction from community and family. And now look at Kalavati, she's not able to go back to her family and not able to.
That's what we just wanted to highlight, Shapin, that, despite the fact that she's, doing well, and first of all, she became unwell only as a result of the losses, because she did say that she had a normal childhood and, adolescence, and she was okay till 25, and there was domestic abuse as a result of which her mental health, maybe it was prodromal and it exacerbated, but it became it became what it was only as a result of the abuse.
Yes.
And she had 3 children and no access to reproductive rights, and being abused by her husband after the birth of her child, and abandonment as a result, and worsening mental health, experiences of homelessness, and then being admitted in a mental hospital, and now not having any exit options. So I just wanted to consolidate what she said. Shapin, thank you. I will come back to you if we have any questions, but if there are any comments or questions for Kalavati from the panelists, we can address that. So then can we, Dr. Prabha, if you don't have any questions for Kalavati, maybe move to your case study?
So, Mrinalini, I just want to sort of highlight certain things in addition to, of course, the story of the lady that I'm going to share. I also want to talk a little bit about the problems with, programs and insurance schemes. And that's something that I think you brought up about the ration cards, and Soumitra brought up. The fact is that there are lots of schemes on paper. Let me just give you a small example of the kind of issues which are going on. Now, I work in a government hospital. So anybody who has a below poverty line card gets free treatment. Now, what happens when a woman gets married? Her BPL status moves from her parents' card to her husband's card. And if she's married, if her name is not in the husband's card, then she's not considered to be BPL, and she will not get free treatment. Now, in a very poor family, when a woman has a psychiatric illness and she's admitted and she needs care, or even any kind of illness, if her name is not in her, it's still in her maternal family's card and is not in her husband's card, she's not eligible even for the Ayushman Bharat scheme. So you see the whole problem here, that you have these schemes, but it's such an unfortunate thing. The man continues to have his name in the card regardless of his marital status. But the woman's name moves from her marital home to her husband's home. And if during this period, for some reason, if there's a delay in the shifting of the BPL card, like during the pandemic, for example, 2 years, nothing happened. There were no new cards given. As a result, women are deprived not just of food, but they're also deprived of health insurance, of health rights. And where will they pay from? So I think this is a very serious problem that we really need to consider. I really don't know why this should happen, why a woman's status for her entitlements, which the government gives, should be linked to her marriage. And it creates so many problems because most women in our country get pregnant within a year of their marriage. They don't really have a say in the whole, they don't have many reproductive rights. They don't have much say. And here I'm talking about the more, like Soumitra said, not the urban educated, which is like 10%. I'm talking about the majority of women who don't have a say. And you know that during pregnancy, there are all kinds of complications that can happen, including mental health problems. And because of this whole BPL status, if a woman is poor, she will not get any of the benefits that the government has to offer. So I think these are some of the very real issues which cause a lot of distress in an already very distressing situation. A woman comes, mentally ill, depressed, suicidal, and here we are asking her to get a card which entitles her for free treatment, which otherwise she will not get. So I think we need to sort of keep that in context, and that's caused a lot of distress during the pandemic. That systems have not sort of said, okay, it doesn't matter if she doesn't have that card, she can still get Ayushman Bharat. It's a simple thing that can be done so easily. But it's not been done unless, it's a case-by-case basis. That's one thing. The second thing, you talked a bit about, the fact that women did not have facilities for terminations of pregnancy. One of the things that we found, so we did a study with all the one-stop centers in Karnataka, trying to understand, what they were facing. And one-stop centers are basically centers across the country. There are about 700 of them, 570 odd are functional. Each district has a one-stop center, which is by the Women and Child Development Ministry, where women who are in distress, who face violence, access the service. And there are 5 beds, women can stay there with their children. So obviously during COVID, people could not come. Women didn't have transport. So they were facing a lot of violence, but they would not reach. So we asked the one-stop centers what happened. So firstly, they were not essential services. So many one-stop center staff struggled during the first wave because they were not called essential services. Now, they are essential services, but they were not given that status. So they could not even travel, number one. Number two, they had no training in telecounseling. And they faced the same problems that Soumitra mentioned, that you call up and it's the husband who picks up or a man who picks up, and obviously a woman can't talk, and they didn't have training. There are ways in which you can, using code words, there are methods which have been developed now where even for domestic violence, child abuse, you can figure out a way of sort of understanding that or handling it. But at that point, nobody thought about it. Women were not coming in because they thought it's a place where 5 women will be there and they will get COVID. So protocols were not publicized in the media saying one-stop centers are safe. We've done this, you can come. So that didn't happen. Though the women's helplines became very active, but the one-stop centers, they didn't have transport. So they were very keen to go to the place where the woman was facing violence, but they could not. Another very unique thing we heard from one-stop centers was a lot of young girls below the age of 18 got pregnant during this period. And many young girls were brought. And that was because girls didn't have school or college. They were left in relatives' homes. And many of them were away from their families. So they didn't have that kind of protection. And so a lot of girls were coming in through the POCSO, cases, as well as, unwanted pregnancies, molestation, etc. So I think a lot of these kind of things also happened. So the point I'm saying is, and these are very gendered, each of this is very gendered. The fact that you can't get a medical termination of pregnancy, the fact that you can't go and buy a contraceptive because the stores are shut and you were not able to go, and if you got pregnant, then there were no facilities for MTPs available. The fact that you could not get insurance, the fact that you were not able to access one-stop services. So I think these were things which I think were very gendered, and I think unfortunately, like you mentioned, many of the task forces did not have women, did not have people from the NGO sector, did not have people who knew what was going on in the field. You had academics and, people who I'm sure were all well-meaning, but probably they didn't know all of this, exactly what was happening. So I think that is when you talk about policy and making policies for women or for children, I think one needs to look at it from that lens. And try to understand what is happening in the field. And I think that was what was lacking and really needs to be something that I think the government needs to ask people who are users about what problems they actually faced. And I think do something about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, Soumitra. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in quickly. The point that Prabha made, and I think Kalavati's story also highlights, is that, there's always been structural discrimination built into our policies and our legislative system about mental illness. That's not very unusual. So, for example, the fact is that the Special Marriage Act and the Hindu Marriage Act actually includes mental illness as a grounds for divorce, which is unusual because in the past we dropped leprosy, we dropped epilepsy, we've also dropped HIV and all, which are not grounds for divorce, but mental illness continues to remain as an illness as a grounds for divorce. Now you'd say, okay, this is a gender neutral provision. But the fact is that in the real life, this doesn't work in a gender neutral way. It works in a very gendered manner. And like Prabha's example of the fact that, okay, ration cards, you need to change from one to the other. That's a gender neutral provision, but it impacts women very specifically and negatively. And similarly with the whole marriage and mental illness issue. Now, the fact is that chronic and severe mental illness is twice as common among men as women. Yeah, that's a fact even Prabha will kind of vouch for. So it's more likely that men are likely to have a severe chronic mental illness. However, when we did a study of divorce cases in Pune's family court over a period of 20 years, okay, this is not a short period, what you find is two things. One is that almost 80% of the cases are filed by men, not by women. Okay, on the grounds that the woman has a mental illness. Okay, so again, what is effectively a gender neutral provision in the law, which is that mental illness, which itself is bad, but even assuming it is bad, it is particularly worse for women with mental illness because then it gets used in a gender neutral, gendered manner. So I think it's very important for us as people involved in policy and for our policymakers to understand and actually interrogate all of our policies and legislation to ask ourselves that while things appear gender neutral, do they actually work in a gender neutral manner on the ground? Because you'll notice that if you don't take these intersectionalities into account, you are going to miss it. You're going to miss the fact that things work in very gendered fashion. And what it does is you created structural discrimination. You created a situation where people like Kalavati then get abandoned by their husbands, or you create a situation where Prabha talks about how women will not get access to care because their name is on a different card. So while they're all very great policies and sound to be gender neutral, they are not gender neutral in reality.
Absolutely. Thank you, Soumitra. Dr. Prabha, I have some questions, but if you'd like to move into your case study and then we can, again, go back into a discussion.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the sort of some of it we have already discussed, the fact that, women came to us, several women came to us with unwanted pregnancies, and that then sort of played out in the, pandemic with some amount of obstetric violence which happened. So when they went into services, particularly if they were found to be COVID positive, the babies in the initial stages, what happened was each hospital had a different policy. And though the WHO and the RCOG and the American Gynec Society had actually said, do not separate the baby from the mom if she has COVID, she can continue to breastfeed, many people didn't do that. And as a result, there was what we call obstetric violence, where women's rights during the obstetric sort of period were not respected. So one, there was non-availability of termination facilities, and two, babies were taken away, kept in a nursery, not shown to the mother. Mother was not allowed to breastfeed. She was all alone after cesarean. And we had quite a few mothers who came in with postpartum depression, inability to bond with the baby because the babies were separated and women themselves were going through so many crises. And we had to kind of, struggle through it quite a lot. And we then started a perinatal helpline, mental health helpline, 24/7, which got about 400 calls within 5 months, where women who are, in pregnant or in the postpartum period were accessing services for mental health. So I think, that was the kind of need which emerged, which again, I think was, some of us who are interested in the area took the initiative, but it was not a systemic response, which ideally should have been there. The good thing that happened was that a lot of obstetricians who were very sensitive sort of got together and started training themselves in mental health issues. So I think that was something which sometimes, COVID did something good. And I think one of the things that happened during the pandemic was that mental health came to the forefront quite a bit. And a lot of people, including physicians and obstetricians, actually started getting themselves educated because they realized that that was a very huge need. I also want to highlight one of the things that you discussed, and that was about the impact of food insecurity on women's mental health. We have a cohort of basically we are following up mothers and babies from the time the moms were pregnant, and now these kids are 4 and 5 years old, and these are very young families. So food insecurity has been a huge issue. And when we call these, so we've done 2 waves of assessments over the phone with families where there are young children. The major stress that mothers have, I'm sure the fathers also have, but the mothers, somehow for them, giving food to their children is like something so important for a mother. Making sure that their family is fed is one of the basic things that give a mother a lot of happiness. And many mothers have sobbed on the phone and said that, there is no food, there is no milk. The families there are families who've had to beg, literally beg. And these are not families who were, extremely deprived earlier. So again, systems have failed some of these families. Many families have actually considered ending their lives because of the level of debt and the fact that, people have are harassing them for, recovering the debt. And all of this happens in front of the children. We have a method by which we reimburse women for their time on the phone. So we do a 1-hour interview and we give them 250 rupees because they are giving us time. The women ask us and tell us that, ask us, when are you going to do the interview again? Because this 250 rupees will feed my family today and tomorrow. So it's that bad. And the food insecurity is that bad. So I think Soumitra keeps talking about how mental health is so connected to economic issues. I think we cannot forget the fact that poverty is one of the biggest social determinants for poor mental health. And COVID has actually driven many people in many families, particularly the urban poor, into poverty. And that has had a huge impact on mental health.
Yes, absolutely. And we haven't even, we spoke about Dalit women, we spoke about somewhat touched upon tribal women, but we haven't spoken about sex workers during the pandemic, who were one of the most impacted and very silently suffering. And of course, trans people. And trans people, I'm seeing something very, I don't know if it's true or false, but I'm seeing 3 new cases, 4 new cases. We don't even know if the cases are being reported. Where is the, help that they can access? And we don't know where sex workers are accessing, basic needs, because during the lockdown, everything shut down. And I know there were small pockets in some NGOs in Karnataka were working with them to form self-help groups. But I was just wondering if the 2 of you had any thoughts in this regard on what is happening to sex workers. Is anybody looking into this, and what is going to happen to them?
Prabha, if you want to take that question, because honestly, while I recognize the problem, I have no particular experience during the pandemic to be able to give any kind of a considered response from experience at all.
We have been working with some sex worker collectives and helping their organizations to work on with their mental health issues, and the fact that they are anyway very, very marginalized, and during this period got even more marginalized because they had no income, and they just did not know what to do. Many of them took to sort of begging and requesting people, going back to their families, getting more abused. There was no easy answer. And I think wearing a psychiatrist hat, it's so easy to say, I'm going to assess depression and treat it, or I'm going to assess anxiety and treat it. But this is more a depression due to an existential issue, that things that you normally do, you don't have access to. So I think that there are many such marginalized communities which probably, really did not get enough attention and still don't have enough attention. And I think it's something that we need to, constantly be working with. I don't have any solutions to this because, I was looking at some data and some evidence to say, what are the factors which bring down, abuse or violence? There have been about 100 studies on domestic violence and violence against women, gender-based violence in low and middle income countries during the pandemic, database studies. And only one of them, and Soumitra knows this study from Brazil, which found that, giving economic incentives actually brought down, abuse and suicide rates also, both. So I think regardless of whatever else we say, at this point, we know that there are certain social factors and economic factors which seem to be big drivers to poor mental health. And I would think that in addition to all the mental health support and the listening and the helplines and everything else, there needs to be that kind of scaffolding which happens from society. So for example, domestic workers, that was a huge group, right? So where women who help us run our families, who help us in our careers because they handle things at home when we are out working and furthering our careers, many of the families didn't pay them, and how did they sustain themselves? How did they, apartment blocks would not allow them to come in. There was a lot of discrimination, sort of assuming that they are the carriers of COVID, which is probably not true. And the way they were treated when they would enter apartment buildings. And this was particularly true in the first wave and a little bit also in the second wave. So I think at every level, women who were more marginalized tended to have more discrimination, including nurses. I found that most of the nurses are women, and nurses have told me how their families want them to just stay in the hospital. Don't come home. Because you're going to spread COVID to our family. So I think many of these situations, so sex workers, domestic workers, garment factory workers, there's a range of people for whom livelihood is so important for their identity, for their confidence, for their status in society, which, was completely taken away. And we must recognize that these are the kind of mental health issues that women were grappling with.
Absolutely. Soumitra? You had your hand up.
I just wanted to pick up on where Prabha left off on that thing about suicide. I mean, I know we've discussed a lot about all the problems that are there. I'm sure your audience will say, oh, wonderful, we know the problems, and we just kind of sitting here and breastbeating about all the problems that exist. So what are the solutions? I think going back, I was going to bring up that Brazil study and the Indonesia study specifically for that. So for people who don't understand it, this is just an amazing study, and I'm going to take a couple of minutes to actually tell people the details about it. This is a study stretching over 15 years and has a cohort of about 100 million people, which is half the population of Brazil. Okay, so this is a large study done over 15 years. And what they did was they looked at people who had received cash transfers. I think there were conditional cash transfers in Brazil at that time. It's a family program. It's called the BFP. And what you find over 15 years is that people who received cash transfers, the suicide rate among them reduced by 61%. This is huge, okay? 61%. We do not have a single mental health intervention today which can reduce suicides by 61%, okay? And even more interestingly, the effect was more marked for women and for young people. Again, the most vulnerable people for suicides. A similar study from Indonesia showed an 18% reduction in suicides. Again, these are numbers where the suicides, no mental health intervention does that. So I think it's time for us to start moving away from just talking about social determinants of mental health problems and then say, oh, but we need to improve access to mental health services, but to actually start talking about addressing these social determinants to prevent mental health problems and to solve mental health problems. The mayor of Stockton in California made a very interesting statement. This was a mayor who pushed for a pilot in his city for cash transfers. And he said, and the study is interesting. You should go up and look them up. It's called, the website is SEED, SEED. And basically what they found was that people who got cash transfers actually had better mental health. And he said, for many kinds of anxiety and depression, cash is a better treatment than Prozac. And I kind of fully appreciate and understand what he's saying, because unless you address food insecurity, as Prabha said, unless you address the fact that people live in poverty, unless you address all of that, focusing purely on mental health as a pure mental health issue, as a health issue, in the way that you might focus on some other health issues, is Band-Aid. This is Band-Aid. When you need significant structural surgery, what you're then doing is providing Band-Aid by saying, oh, we provide you with counseling, or we provide you with treatment for mental health problems. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying shut down mental health treatment, but what I'm trying to tell you is that that's not the solution. That is the most important issue that we need to address, the elephant in the room, in a sense, which is the fact that social determinants cause mental health problems and can solve mental health problems sometimes more effectively than health interventions can. And that, I think, we should, as a society, as policymakers, that's what we should be focusing on for us to really make an impact. And I hope the pandemic has brought that home to all of us, because we are all vulnerable at the end of the day. Everybody is likely to have a mental health problem given the stresses of the pandemic.
Absolutely. And this also again and again brings to light the fact that we pathologize systemic issues to individual issues. So we are listing, having a laundry list of so many problems that women have to undergo, people from marginalized communities have to undergo, and then after that, but our approach as mental health professionals has always been to look at what the individual can do rather than what the system can do for them. So I think that's very, very crucial in the context, especially of developing countries or low and middle income countries, where the systemic issues are rife and post-colonial systems or governments have not really been in a position to understand that. So the distress just gets perpetuated and becomes intergenerational. And with regard to the basic income study, the one in California, what the mayor wanted to do, I think what he had also talked about, just sort of digressing a little bit, is that he said the labor market is anyway going to undergo a very sea change in the next 10 to 20 years. Everything is becoming automated, and people are continuing to be forced into jobs that they don't want to do simply because they can't afford to do anything else. And building a sort of like having this basic income for, I think it was $500 a month for everybody, everybody in the city, will also help them explore more options that will match them, more closely to the labor market 10 to 20 years from now, and it will become more sustainable. And it will also, beyond financial security, also give a sense of satisfaction that there is a job well done, rather than, continuing with the drudgery of work that you don't enjoy doing. And it has long-term mental health and socio-economic implications.
So I think one of the things that probably, again, related to women, and it's affecting a lot of women's mental health. And here we're talking not just about the rural, low literacy women, but even urban women. I think people working from home, women working from home have really struggled, and particularly teachers in schools have kind of struggled with balancing the whole work and their home life. And I think that, there's been a lot of discussion about how children are using a lot of mobile phones and parents are not paying attention. But I think women themselves have been balancing multiple roles, in this context. And definitely the burden has fallen much more on the women than on the men, even in urban sort of so-called educated, privileged families. So I think I just want to highlight that when we are talking about the mental health burden of the pandemic, it's not just in those who are marginalized, but it's also sort of impacted others greatly.
Absolutely. Soumitra?
The point I was trying to make was that, you run the Home Again program, and let's take housing as a factor for mental illness, okay? And there is enough research now from across the world which shows if you look at housing first services, what housing first services do is normally the traditional approach has been, we should, if you're homeless and have a severe mental illness, which is what many homeless people, half of the people who are homeless have a severe mental illness. And the standard process has always been, we should stabilize your mental illness, treat you for the mental illness, and only after that we can look for an independent accommodation or house for you. Whereas what do housing first programs do? Housing first programs, as they say, housing first, they get you into an independent or supported housing and build the services.
I think he's again in bad network zone, Soumitra. So, yeah, I think
maybe he can put off his video. That might work, you think? Maybe we can start taking some questions.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we can start. So you have answered most of the questions, Dr. Prabha, I think. There was one question on vaccination. Were you able to see that, or?
Yes, I was able to see that. In fact, there's been a lot of discussion about the impact of vaccination on the menstrual cycle, and I don't think we have enough data. I think it's something which needs to be discussed because many women have been talking about menstrual cycle irregularities. Now, unfortunately, the vaccine-related side effects are something that have not been captured very well. Only extremely severe side effects have been captured to some extent. But the sort of regular, I'm not saying that one should not take the vaccine because of that, but the fact is that if there are side effects, then women should just be a bit aware about what might happen to their bodies and to know whether is it because of the vaccine or is it not. And, sort of dispel some of those myths and give the actual facts. But unless we have data, we are not going to be able to find out. We also know that what is happening in the bodies of Indian women are not the same as bodies of Western women. Bodies of women are not the same as bodies of men. So I think these are some of the things that we really need to understand better. So I completely agree with the person who's asked the question that there are possibilities that things are happening, but we have not really captured that data. And unfortunately, we've lost a wonderful opportunity to capture that data. Because, if there was some way in which there could be like a place where people could report, that this is what is happening to them, then at least we could sort of, sift through the data, see what is related, see what is not related. But now we don't have that opportunity at all.
Yeah. Do we, since you've answered, you've been answering questions, if I can ask two questions, one with regard to rates of postpartum depression and experience of, postpartum depression or psychosis amongst women during this period. Is anything happening in this regard? Do we have some preliminary data?
Yes, we do have data. So we have two kinds of data. We have data among women during the pandemic, about anxiety and depression, and we have data among women who had COVID infection at the time of childbirth. Like we discussed earlier, if you look at a clinical depression, the rates are probably kind of just marginally more. But when you ask for experiential, sort of narratives, or you ask about specific anxiety related to the fetus, related to the baby, related to the breastfeeding, we are getting much, much higher rates. So I think if you look at the range of data from the world and from India, we've just got, a couple of studies accepted and soon to be published. What we found is that the rates don't seem to be phenomenally high of clinical depression and anxiety. But what is coming through is that there's a lot of anxiety symptoms which women are reporting. And I think, and also these are very COVID specific anxiety, which may not be captured in the kind of tools that we have to capture sort of other kind of depression and anxiety. So when we interpret the data, it's very important for us to address the fact that there is anxiety. Women who had COVID infection during childbirth really struggled. And this is true in the first wave. I think by the second wave, systems had kind of got organized, including obstetric services, and things were much better. But in the first wave, the rates of anxiety were much more. In fact, anxiety was much higher than depression. And the fact that women did not have access to their own obstetrician. In many situations, what happened was that they were shunted into a COVID hospital if they were positive. And so they had no link with the new obstetrician. So if a woman had had a mental health problem earlier, and it was in her records with her previous obstetrician, this was not available to the new obstetrician. And so women had relapses related to that. And we saw quite a few women coming with relapses because their new obstetrician had no clue that this was happening because it was a COVID hospital that they had to go to. So these kind of things which I think were not sort of planned or envisaged did happen for quite a few women during this period.
Thank you. And also, I think that, the way, I think what you said about tools, the current tools that we're using simply don't seem to be able to capture the realities, because we can say, 6 points, 7 points, but it's so much more than that. So I think in terms of both reporting and capturing the data, we need more qualitative inputs, we need more case studies, and we need to work more on a one-on-one basis in keeping with larger data.
Yeah, I also want to talk a little bit about cultural issues during the perinatal period and grief. Both of these became big issues. One was a lot of women in our country have certain, we have certain rituals which happen during pregnancy, which happen during postpartum, which in some ways increase social support, help the woman be, feel kind of validated and feel good about herself. And all of these were not there. So women who thought these were important felt that they kind of missed out on, many things which were sort of culturally sanctioned kind of sort of protective things in, for women in the perinatal period. The second thing was, I think a lot of women who could not go to their maternal families because of no travel, no flights, lockdowns, testing mandates from borders being closed. Again, there was an issue because, traditionally they would have liked to go to a place where they felt more comfortable and more supported. And I think, so that was taken away from them. So I think some of these experiences, and I also worry about the infants who were born during this period, because they saw everybody masked and, the kind of expressions that, and there are studies going on about infants born during this period, and did they sort of miss out on expressions from their parents, because most of the time people were actually masked, or they didn't have that many networks. So it was only mother and father and not the rest of the, there were many couples who managed the baby all by themselves because of COVID, and that was extremely stressful for quite a few people. Also want to highlight the role of men's mental health and women's mental health, which came up quite a bit during COVID, particularly unemployment in men. And we know that unemployment in men increases domestic violence, increases alcohol use. And I think I also feel that in a situation like this, if we want to improve women's mental health, particularly related to violence, then we really also need to address men's mental health. And that's something that, I think is I would like to sort of flag that as an important aspect.
Thank you. Soumitra, you got cut off. Do you have anything to add?
No, the only point I was trying to say, and really the point I'm trying to make, is that that we need to, while we need to provide mental health services, it's important. I think it's even more important that we actually provide for basic services, which the structural issues, to deal with the discrimination, the unemployment, the housing issues, the lack of finances and poverty. And I think that if we want to really impact mental health in terms of both promotion, prevention, rehabilitation, come at it from every different way, then really taking a very narrow curative perspective on it, which is to say, I will diagnose if you have depression and here's your treatment for it, misses the large chunk of what we should be doing as a society. That we as a society need to address these structural issues which make people prone to getting mental illness, which keep people in that mental health illness state, and which result in worse outcomes. So, I think that's really where, if there's one message from the pandemic, really has to be that we can't afford these structural issues to be just, well, that's how we are kind of a thing, and a shrug of the shoulders, but to say that they are fundamental to addressing mental health problems in the country.
Yeah, and we will be talking about this in the closing remark. We have one last, little time for one last question, and it relates to the closing remarks. I just wanted to know what your thoughts are with regard to, representation, because we talked about, women only forming 13% of the task force were women. And if you see, every forum, whether it's political or systemic or medical, we see women left out of this conversation. My question to the both of you is, why is this representation not happening, and what are the we are seeing the impact of the representation not happening, but I want to know why and how we can rectify it, if at all.
But Prabha can go first.
Yeah.
I wish I had the answer, Mrinalini. I don't, because I don't know why there should not be representation, because we know that there are enough women who can inform policy, who are experts either by academics or by their work, or by experts by experience. So I think that the whole culture in our country of making sure that a committee is representative, is not really there all the time. I think they try tokenism, but it's not there all the time. So there will be a token woman, there will be a token NGO, but is it coming from sort of within, and this is true for everything. I mean, even in research studies, for example, if you look at the UK, they have experts by experience in each research study to inform you. And that doesn't happen here. So I think it's about the way you look at committees, which are very often top down, and the approach is like, we are going to tell you what to do and you do. It's not that let's listen to what's going on in the field and then let's make plans, because then it'll be successful. If you think that, if I think I know what a sex worker in Mumbai is going through, I'm fooling myself, So either you kind of accept that we don't know enough, and not be patronizing and say what I think is right, and you should do what I think is right, and are willing to listen to people, or you make sure that you learn at least, you make sure that you get reports from people. So I think the whole thing should be the other way around. Voices should be emerging from below rather than we getting all the gyan from top. That's what I would say.
Yeah, because we know that participatory approaches definitely yield more results, and getting people involved in the community, whether it's photo voice or whatever approach that you want to take, it has yielded more results. But I'm flummoxed as to why it doesn't happen, because we've responded, and we've also seen the disastrous impact of having a terrible representation of women versus men, and we have a bunch of men sitting around and deciding what is good for our reproductive health. And we don't need to get into the disaster that's going on in Texas right now with regard to reproductive rights of women.
Yeah.
So I just want to know what is...
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, it's not just about men and women. You can have women who are also urban educated, who sort of don't know what's happening out there in the rural area, or who don't know what your garment factory worker woman is struggling with. So I think while it is important for the gender representation, I would also emphasize that it's about representation at all levels,
Absolutely. Soumitra?
Yeah, I mean, I think the disability community has a very nice phrase, which I think all of us should adopt, which is nothing about us without us. And so that is how it should be, nothing about anybody without anybody. And when I hear about the representation of women, I mean, I of course support it. And why does it happen? I have no idea why it happens, but that's how we have always been. Maybe patriarchy is the reason for it. But I would like to also caution people, and this is going along with what Prabha is saying, is that when we say women representation, then let it not just be upper caste, English speaking, urban women, okay? There are Dalit women, non-English speaking, rural women. There are trans people. I mean, gender is much more than just having an upper caste English speaking woman from one large metro. And there are geographical differences. You know, the experiences of women, say in Kerala, would be very different to the experiences of women in some of the northern states. So we really need to understand that when we talk about representation, we really need diversity. You know, that's what we are. We are an extremely diverse society, an extremely diverse country. And that diversity needs to be represented when policy and programs are being formulated for everybody.
Thank you. If there are no questions from the audience, maybe we can just, if there are, we can give our last remarks, closing remarks. Okay. I don't think there are any questions. So yeah, so basically, thank you so much, Dr. Prabha and Soumitra, for coming on this session. And it was an absolute privilege. It's very sad that we discuss what we are discussing 60, 75 years into independence even now, like basic question of women not being part of the workforce or women not having equal economic rights, reproductive rights, and the mental health concerns that emerge as a result continue to be pathologized and continue to be biomedical. We are not including women in women of all kinds of women, and like Soumitra said, gender is a construct. So we our representation is still wanting, and we don't seem to. We seem to have the answers, but we don't seem to really be moving forward in many senses. That is, but good things are happening, and you know, there are, like Dr. Prabha said, that you know, a lot of SHGs have been convened during this period. Obstetricians have come together to understand mental health, because they can be extremely judgmental, and you know, I've experienced that myself. So there are changes that are happening, but not nearly at the pace that they should be. But one thing that we have taken, we can take from this discussion is that the role of intersectionality has to be taken into consideration when talking about mental health. Poverty is a huge factor in exacerbating mental health concerns, not just of women, but you know, people from all kinds of marginalized communities, and even men for that matter. And to address women's mental health, we need to address men's mental health as well. There shouldn't be this kind of bifurcation, and the solutions and the implementation of solutions need to come bottom up. So I think and we've also talked about the impact of basic income, and really bringing down suicide rates by 18% itself is a huge deal. And then we have 61% in Brazil. Yeah, so basically that, you know, basic income has been a solution. We actually have solutions all over the place, but we really just need to put it into action and get proper representation in order for this to happen. And we have to let go of, you know, bygone era ways of assessing depression, assessing anxiety, to get more qualitative and individual level inputs and case studies and stories, and look at very customized care plans in keeping with the larger systemic and structural barriers in mind. So thank you very much, everybody, once again. And it was a pleasure hosting this session.